Disclaimer warning. This video was made over the course of one evening with nothing but my phone, CapCut, a whiteboard I haven't used since middle school, and a dream. It is completely unscripted, minimally edited, and fairly incoherent. Also, my hair looks really bad in it. You know what you're getting into now. Enjoy.
So, The Widow. Malevolent's very first foray into original monsters. Unless you ascribe to the train of thought that she is a ghoul, in which case, I don't care. What we know about the Widow can be summarized like this. She was a woman whose husband did something really terrible, and he was buried on this island in the middle of Lake Crawford called the Devil's Graveyard. And Mr. Spooky, Ominous Frenchman tells us most of what we know about the Widow. He describes a devil's graveyard as such. A devil's graveyard is where you bury your very unwanted. Murderers, killers, monsters. And he says the people who buried them put them where they could not leave. And he implies that not everyone who was buried in the devil's graveyard was dead when they were buried, which is interesting. And he tells us about the widows. He tells us about how many years ago, before the fog came in, which is interesting. We'll get back to that later, probably. A man dies who could not be forgotten. By the town, yes. But his wife, none. Because he's French. She would not leave his side, not even in death. And he says something very interesting here. Which is, they tried to convince her, they being the people who buried him, that it was death, but she does not leave. That's interesting, because it implies that the widow thought he was still alive. He says the widow came to live, at least in a way. And as he's sort of explaining the widow, we get our first mention of Antoine, who will be very relevant later. By the way, I probably should preface this. This video is assuming you know Malevolent. If you're watching this and you don't know Malevolent, sorry. He talks about the lighthouse keeper at the time, by saying that some say that the widow stayed with the lighthouse keeper, and some say that she didn't. And he says perhaps it was improper. So here we have our first little tangent of trying to figure out when the widow was on the island. So based on what we learn in Call of Cthulhu Game 1 about Antoine's goings-on, we can probably put this pretty firmly. No one saw me struggle with that. Between 1255 to 1890. Because 1255 is when... You can kind of see that. Is that flipped? Shit. I'll just flip the video, probably, maybe. I promise it sells 1255 to 1890. So, 1255 is when Enty dies. And 1890, we know Antoine, based on Anna's journals, we know Antoine is a butler at Beatrice Caldwell's estate. So, as you can tell, this is like what? Not quite 1600. 600. Actually, no, that is about 600 years there. So, big span of time. This is a lot of time for things to happen. But the lighthouse was already here. So, based on my very basic research, lighthouses were like first starting to be put in the Americas in the 1700s. So that narrows it down a lot. Which really puts it from like 1710 to, assuming, because Antoine was an established butler at Beatrice Coldwell's estate. So we'll go with 1889. So 1710 to 1889. Now, later on, what's her face? Sarah. Oh my god, I might have to cut that out of this video. I can't believe I just forgot her name. In her letter to Anna, she says that Antoine spent hundreds of years, that's hundreds, plural, in between the lighthouse and the cult cave that we'll talk about more later. So, as you can tell, this is like, I guess if you round up, it could be 200 years. The thing is, hundreds of years is such a vague timescape. So, who knows? And presumably the widow was not with him for all of those hundreds of years, although maybe she was. I don't know. Here's the thing. This is a classic Harlan Guthrie, like, spooky area where plot details are hinted at, just enough to give you a general picture, but there's no real specifics. So I feel like it's pretty safe to say somewhere from 1700 to 1889 is when the widow was here, which is, you know, in there you've got, like, the Revolutionary era, actually, all the way to the Victorian era. So that's a long span of time, but I can assume in any of that time period, a widowed woman staying with a random man who was not family probably would be improper. So this is when the widow was here. It's not very specific, I know. I would imagine Harlan probably never had a specific year in mind, but here I am thinking too hard about it. Oh well. Another tangent. As far as I can tell, devil's graveyards are not a real thing, based on my very basic research. Devil's graveyards, not a real thing. That's not that much surprise. There is a book called The Devil's Graveyard. There's actually several books called The Devil's Graveyard, none about criminal graveyards. There's a rock formation in Texas called the Devil's Graveyard. So it's not a real thing. So that wasn't helpful in determining the time period. Yay. I'm losing my mind. So, continuing on with what Mr. Spooky Ominous French Lighthouse Keeper tells us about the widow, he emphasizes that she was not a weak woman. It takes immeasurable strength to leave everything behind. He tells us about how she built her house with lake stones piece by piece, which will be backed up later by the fact that her house is built, the floor is black stones, and then the walls are wood that's been peeled. And John describes everything in the widow's house as looking homemade. So that tracks. Everything the lighthouse keeper tells us about her has to be taken with a grain of salt because he is hearing this from other people. So there's probably some things lost in translation, but we can probably trust that her house was at least built in some aspect by her. But what's interesting that the lighthouse keeper says is she was not alone. She was with her husband. And when questioned about this, because, you know, her hubby's dead, he just repeats, she was not alone. Interesting. Especially given that earlier we were told that the people who buried him tried to convince her he was dead, but she didn't listen. Interesting. I don't know what this means, but it's very interesting. Another little tangent that I don't know where I'll put it in the video. I just put this together. When he's talking about the widow, he says, many years ago, before the iron weakened, before the fog came in. And the fog is, of course, what's on the island that's serving as making it sort of this barrier between this realm and, like, the Dreamlands, or, like, just general spooky shit. The fog represents that weakening of the barrier, as we see in Leary in Call of Cthulhu Game 2. And the fog is actually given a strange sort of sentience on this island, but that's a whole nother topic. We're not here to talk about that. But he says before the iron weakened, and what I realized while I was looking at the transcripts to find details for this, that the graveyard gate, the Devil's Graveyard Gate, is described as wrought iron, and it's decayed. It's half sunken into the ground. So I think that's a connection there, and I think that's really cool, because I had never realized that before. And I just wanted to put that in this video. So, based on John's descriptions, this is my best sort of, like, guesstimation of what the widow's house looked like. Let me... I can't zoom in. Never mind, I will not zoom in. But you've got the door here, and the staircase is to the right going up. The staircase is half decayed, but I didn't really know how to depict that in a simple drawing. And then there's the kitchen area over here where Sarah's letter is, her first letter. And then there's a corner at right here at the back of the staircase where there's a dresser. They move to the side to reveal the hatch that leads down into the spooky cult cave. And then over here is like a living room area with a table and chairs, and apparently there's books somewhere in here. Don't know where. There's books somewhere, probably. And then there's the fireplace. I don't know if this is accurate. This was just my best guess based on squinting at the transcript really hard. So the most notable things here are the dresser that has the cult hatch. There is a second floor to this place, so, you know, Widow Girly has some good house construction skills. I could not build a second story house. No way. But we never see the top floor, so I don't know what's up there. What's most notable in here there's paintings on the walls, and one painting in particular is of, well, I'll just read the description. Time and a fair amount of dampness have bloated a portrait of a young lady. Her hollow eyes are sagging, and her face looks as though the skin hangs off in loose strands. This is our first glimpse at what is presumably the widow. And there's some fun little foreshadowing from Arthur where he says, I shudder to think what she'd look like now, which is, you know, because they're going to see what she looks like now in the next steps. Yeah, you get it. You get it. And so, they find Amanda's letter, blah, 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 in the corner, down the hatch, cult cave time! Now, if I had thought this through, this is where I would draw a layout of the cult cave and put it up here. But I did not think this through, so we're just gonna talk through where they're going, and hopefully you guys can follow along. It's complicated. I don't really have a grasp of the layout in my head because I didn't think to draw it, so we're just gonna talk. I'm just gonna talk. All of this video is just me talking, by the way, in case you couldn't tell. Day 1 of break, and I've already lost it. So, we're in the cult cave, and the first thing the boys come upon after they come down the stairs is this open space, and there's square holes in the ceiling where the coffins in the graveyard were removed from below, which is fascinating, because what the fuck did Antoine need with all of those dead bodies? Who knows? Also, how the fuck did this place not collapse? Who knows? Cult magic, I guess. I don't know. Maybe there's... I don't know. But also here in this, like, entrance space are 2 rooms. I had initially assumed there were many more rooms than this, but there's only really 2 that they go into. And I don't actually think there's that many more described. So who knows if anybody other than the widow and Antoine actually spent time here. I had assumed there was a bunch of cult people here, but after reading the transcript, I'm starting to think it was just the 2 of them. Just the 2 of us. Building castles that's the wrong tune and the wrong lyrics. Don't worry about it. So there's a room with man's clothing that's relatively intact. in a big, like cult robe. And then there is a room with woman's clothing scattered on the floor that the boys hide in when the widow comes in. And they discover that this is the widow's room, which is really interesting that she searches for them in her room. Or is she searching for them? I don't know. But here we get our second description of two, second out of two, of the widow, where John says, "It looked like a woman. Her skin was sagging and old, ancient even." And that's interesting. She's kind of like a decayed corpse is the vibe I get here, like a waterlogged corpse that's like bloated and dripping. Lovely visual, I know. And what's really interesting about... We'll come back to that later. But this room is in a much worse state than the other room. And John describes some of how it's in such a shitty state. The color of the bedspread stained a deep brown and torn, as if the insides of the mattress have been taken out. The bed itself is worn flat, nearly. The table has been knocked over. He goes on to talk. And what's interesting about this to me is that the bedspread is stained a deep brown. Which initially my first thought when I first listened to this episode was like fecal matter and piss and shit. But you know what dries a deep brown in fabric? Blood. That's interesting to me. And the walls in this room have deep gouges in them, as if someone were counting. And so what's really interesting here, I'm saying interesting so many times. I think all of this is really interesting. It almost seems like the implication here is that the widow was trapped in her room for some period of time. Which is fascinating, because it raises the question of, why was she trapped? And was she experiencing the transformation into this monster as she was trapped? I don't know. Because later they'll find, once they leave this room and they come to a split path, and the right leads to the library and the left leads to this like mound of tussled dirt that John says is a nest that something has either been recently buried or unearthed from, and Arthur theorizes that was the widow. And there's like some squirming sound effects. Maggots, maybe? 'Cause she's like a corpse. If it was the widow that was there. So if that was her there, she was at some point taken from her room and brought to that area and buried, I guess. So that's interesting. But in her room, what's probably most memorable is the drawings that are in her bedside table. And so it starts off, presumably, I guess they're on top, are the drawings from the beginning. They're drawings of herself, of the scenery of the island, and of the previous lighthouse keeper, Antoine! My boy! Fucking douchebag. I love him. But yeah, Antoine. And so John says that the first drawings of him are timid, like him sitting on the dock stuff. But then he says there's drawings of him later down the line in a romanticized pose. So I'm imagining Antoine in like a draw me like one of your French girls type pose. Yeah. And aside from the sexy Antoine drawings that John says he assumes they had a relationship based on, there's more images that get darker. There's some sketches of the tunnel and the caves, maybe when this cult hideout was in the early stages of construction. I don't know. Because what Sarah says about Antoine spending hundreds of years between these cult caves and the lighthouse makes me think that maybe they already existed before he met the widow? But then the hatch makes that seem unlikely, so who knows? Harlan Guthrie, I guess. Maybe. Anyways, lock in. I gotta lock in. So there's sketches that get darker, and then past that, those drawings are described as being only, like, impressions rather than, like, sketches. And then beyond that, there's just scribbles, which kind of unnerves John. So, while the widow was trapped in this room, she was sort of slowly losing her mind. Although maybe, this thought just hit me, maybe she wasn't trapped in the room. Maybe she was trapped in the caves. That's interesting. If you hear barking, don't worry about it. My stepmom's letting out the dogs. So, past the library, they find they being the boys, they find a temple of sorts, is how John describes it, which is this huge room with dark stone walls and a carved mural of Shubby on the ceiling. And there's a central altar that has blood on it, which is just interesting. Like something was sacrificed there. Maybe the widow? I don't know. Or maybe that's what they were using all the corpses for. Who knows? We never see any of the corpses from the Devil's Graveyard. So, who knows what happened to all those corpses? I don't know, maybe they ate them. That is actually a point to the ghoul theory, and I'm kind of mad about that. But, we'll come back to that. This isn't theory time, this is recap time. So, the boys go past the temple, they take a left. Again, they go to a dead end, with some crates, storage maybe. Arthur moves a crate, he finds a little, like, crawl tunnel, he crawls through it on his belly. And then, the widow comes after him, after he escapes into this, like, more open area. And he smashes her head with a rock multiple times. Just smash, smash, smash. And John's like, hey, dude, what the fuck? And Arthur's like, fuck you! She was a cultist! This is, like, our first demonstrated moment of, like, Arthur cultist hate. I think when people talk about Arthur cultist hate, this is what they think of. And John says that to him, it seemed like the widow might have been someone who was taken advantage of, which is interesting. Because he doesn't voice this before this moment. Thanks, John. Really helpful. And he proposes that maybe she was coerced into joining this cult, possibly with the prospect of her husband's return. I don't know why she did sexy drawings of Antoine then, but... So, that is all that we know about the widow, which I'm sure you have gathered. It's not a lot. Like I said earlier, it's one of those classic Harlan Guthrie mysteries where the big picture is hinted at, but never really delved into, because it's not plot relevant. Sarah, very clearly says, this is not plot relevant. She says it in other terms, but the message there is, this is not plot relevant, this is set dressing. It's just meant to imply a greater backstory to this world that Arthur and John have stumbled upon. So, as such, the details aren't necessary. And past these two episodes, the widow is not really... She is mentioned again, but only really in the context of Arthur's guilt over smashing her head with a rock. And we never learn anything else about her. She is part of the backdrop of the story. She is part of the backstory. So we never really delve into her as a person, which is why I made this video. So you know what time it is? It's theory time. So, what do we know about the widow for certain? We know she was, according to the Lighthouse Keeper, not a weak woman. We know her hubby died. And he did something really atrocious that made nobody want him in their graveyard. So, hubby was bad. We know she was really dedicated to him, dedicated enough to follow his corpse to this island in the middle of a lake. So she was dedicated to hubby. I put one too many. Hubby. Shabby. Oh my god, guys, I've discovered the kid. No, I haven't. I'm joking. And let's just take a brief tangent here to talk about how insane it is to follow your dead, shitty husband to a graveyard where no one else wants to be because everyone who was buried there was so shitty. Just abandon your whole life and come live on this island in the middle of this fucking lake. This girl was fucking insane. Like, we talk about how she was taken advantage of by Antoine, and everyone's like, oh, poor widow, but the widow was crazy. Who does that? Girl, no man is worth that. Get off the fucking... Okay. Anyways, we know she was in some sort of relationship with Antoine. Or at the very least, she was in some sort of... She was drawing sexy, paint me like one of your French girls pictures of him. So they had something going on. Which is interesting, because Harlan confirmed Antoine is gay. So... yeah, she was in some sort of relationship with Antoine. And she joined Shub Cult, and she became some sort of monster. And she was left here when Antoine went off to be Beatrice's butler. And what's interesting, I've said that so many times, is that it seems like when Antoine left, she was buried. She was dead. She was not up and shambling about, because presumably when Antoine left, the lighthouse was on. And when the lighthouse was on, the widow was not shambling about, otherwise Amanda wouldn't have stayed down there. Sarah. Oh my god. Otherwise Sarah wouldn't have stayed down there. So, this is not a lot, but I do have some theories. So, theory number one, and probably my craziest theory, is that she was maybe like a failed attempt at an arter. There's not really like a lot of evidence for this, except for the fact that in her portrait, her eyes are described as hollow. Well, I guess what I'm saying here is more serif. Her eyes are described as hollow, so maybe she had her eyes taken out, like Alia did. And also there's those gouges on her bed, like she was counting. And Vale talks about, Vale talks about that, Alia was, brought back from some sort of death. And then Lilith expands on that, saying that Alia was pushed to the brink of death and back, and to the brink of death and back, and over and over and over again. So this is a possibility. Is it a strong possibility? It's a possibility. So another possibility is that Antoine turned her into a ghoul. And that what we see is a ghoul. And I will admit, there is some solid evidence for this. Ghouls are kind of like corpse-like. They do have nests. They live underground. And at least in Harlan's mythos, it is established in Call of Cthulhu Game 1 that a person can become a ghoul by eating human flesh. So maybe they ate the corpses and she became a ghoul. But in Malevolent, it is established that ghouls look canine-like, and nothing about the Widow is ever described as looking canine-like. And also, I feel like the big other, like, negative to this theory is, what would Antoine gain by turning this random woman into a ghoul? Like, what would be the purpose of that? What's the point? But it is a possibility, so I'm gonna put that out there. So this is not really a theory, more like a series of connections. So based on what the lighthouse keeper says, when the Widow came to the island, she had some sort of belief that her husband was not dead, that her husband was with her, and that's all it's very vague and spooky. But then later, all of the Devil's Graveyard corpses have been, dug out from underneath, which would include her husband. And she herself is this kind of, reanimated being, and John even theorizes that maybe she joined with the cult to try and bring back her husband. So, that's a possibility. Maybe what they were doing in this cult area was trying to bring people back from the dead. It's a possibility. And now this is, and maybe it kind of worked with her, or the process corrupted her in some way, because clearly she didn't succeed in bringing her hubby back. That didn't happen. But it is possible that's what they were trying to do in this cult area. And I hear you say, what the fuck would Antoine gain from this? He doesn't care about this random lady or her husband. But Antoine does care about his master, Enti, who's also super dead. So maybe he was trying to bring Enti back? Who knows? I don't know. That's a possibility. Again, I guess that is more of a theory, but just putting that out there. I don't know if at this point Antoine would have Enti's corpse. I'd have to check Nikki's timeline. Maybe. Who knows? Nikki, if you see this video, just tell me if I'm wrong. Okay, moving on. So, there's not a lot of answers here, and I'm not trying to give answers. This is just crazy project that spawned into my brain and I decided to make a reality. But what sort of stood out to me, which is, it's probably just because I have recently been watching Flawed Peacock's 9-hour video essay on the King in Yellow book, which you should watch. It's a great video. I'm not done with it, but it's a really good video. This is a surprisingly King in Yellow story. I don't know if that was intentional, because, Sarah very explicitly says, this place has nothing to do with the King in Yellow. But this is a very traditional, yellow mythos story, which is interesting. I think it's an interesting coincidence. I don't know if it was intentional. The only person who knows that is Harlan. I'm not Harlan. I don't even know if he'll see this video. If you're seeing this video, hi. But this is a very, it's very traditional yellow mythos story. There's this love story between the widow and her husband, or between the widow and Antoine, that's being, touched and corrupted by this theme of, death and sickness and decay and cult shit. So that's interesting. I don't know if it was intentional, but it's interesting. And just in general, as I hope, I've said the word so many times, I hope this widow video essay has, if nothing else, managed to convey that the widow is a really interesting character. There's a lot, I think, to dig into there about what would motivate a woman to come to this island in the middle of this fuck-ass lake for her dead hubby who was so shitty no normal graveyard wanted him. And then what would motivate her to join this fuck-ass cult for this goddess, this fertility goddess of, like, Shub's whole thing. Woods, babies, death, actually? That's interesting, actually. Yeah, because John describes Shub as death incarnate. So, that's kind of a point to my question mark theory. Yay me. Anyways. Why would she, if she was so devoted to her husband, why would she get it going with the lighthouse keeper / cult leader? What era did this take place in? Someone tell me. What did Antoine want from her? What was Antoine doing here? Was he just collecting information? How was he collecting information? Why did he unearth all those coffins? There's a lot of questions here. And I suppose if nothing else, I hope this video essay motivates more people to think about these questions and ponder them and maybe come up with your own answers. Because I think there's a lot of fun there's a lot of fun stuff to play in here. And I would like to see more people play in there because it interests me. Yeah. I will be writing a fic about the Widow at some point. Whenever I finish it. Yeah. So that's all. I can't think of a better way to end this, so Graham out. If this is what I do on the first day of break, the rest of this week is gonna be a struggle. We'll see what other insanity I get up to. Thanks for watching. Don't subscribe. I don't really post YouTube videos. Peace out.